I am Hanli Ardendorf from the Center for Teaching and Learning, and in this podcast we're going to return to where you finished with the previous podcast. In that case, you'll remember we asked you to put together a storyboard for your module, and that's where we're going to start. We're going to pick up with that and do some more work on your storyboard. Now, your storyboard might not look exactly like this one, but it should have some similarities. This is a storyboard that we put together in the previous podcast. And you'll remember that one of the last steps that you had to do was to identify the areas in which your students typically get stuck. Those would be the areas in which you see their eyes glazing over while you're teaching, or it might be where they get stuck in assessments, the things that they get wrong repeatedly. In our case, we identified two spots in the third week and in the third week, for example, community norms here. So what we want you to do next is to go into this in a bit more detail. For now, we've just highlighted what it is that they're struggling with, but what we really have to do is explain it in a bit more detail. Now, these spaces in which students get stuck are what experts call student learning bottlenecks. And Shopko and David Pace and Middendorf have put together a process consisting out of 7 steps in which they try to help academics help their students overcoming these problems. In other words, help students move from novice thinking to expert thinking in the area. And that is what we're going to do in this video. We're going to spend some time just giving you an overview of the 7 steps. I need to mention at this point in time that we will make available additional material for each one of the 7 steps, which you can use and follow. But in the podcast, I will share a little bit more of how we're going to use this in pre-DAC and what will happen in the pre-DAC process. Right, here we have a graphical representation of the 7 steps that I have just referred to. And we'll go into each one of these in a little bit of detail just to give you an idea of what they are about. You might notice at this stage that step 1, defining a bottleneck, is what you've already done when you did the storyboard. However, if you are new to teaching the module or to the discipline, then you might have had some difficulty with this step. If that is you, if it applies to you, one of the ways in which you could overcome this or address this problem is to consult with an expert in your field or someone who's taught this module before. You can do this via email or face-to-face and ask such a person in their experience where it is that students are getting stuck when they are in this module and trying to learn whatever it is that you want them to learn in the module. Okay, so now looking at this graphical representation, I'm going to take you through what it is that we're going to do in pre-DAC quickly. I've already said that you have started by doing this. We're going to return to this in a little bit more detail in a moment because you might have to do a little bit of extra work to make sure that what you bring to the contact session is useful as it is. What we're going to do when we get to the contact session, and some of this prior to getting there, if you want to, is to start uncovering the mental tasks that experts would take when they are trying to overcome or such bottlenecks or the processes that helps them not getting stuck on the bottlenecks at which our novice learners usually get stuck. The next step in the process usually is to model these tasks and then to create opportunities where students can practice and get feedback when they are doing such tasks. I'm going to stop at these two for a moment. This is what's going to happen straight after the contact session in the part of pre-DAC which we often call the design for learning phase of pre-DAC. Here you are going to spend some time modeling, figuring out how to model the tasks to students and specifically creating opportunities for them to practice and get feedback. You might find that you have to do some work preparing your students for this, helping them overcome whatever resistance they might have and motivating them to do the work. And then you're going to do some work assessing the student mastery of these tasks, seeing whether what you have put in place is of any value and had helped them learn. And then finally, in our total conference towards the end of the second semester in our finalization of pre-DAC, we are going to give you an opportunity to share some of these findings with your colleagues. We are now going to start by looking in a little bit more detail at the different steps, and starting with step 1, the one of defining a student learning bottleneck or identifying such a bottleneck, which you said you have already done some of this. You've at least identified the places in which your students tend to get stuck in your module. The next thing we have to do is we have to write this or define this or explain this in a way that is useful for us to work with. So just saying that my students cannot interpret text, or in our previous case, the very simple definitions or explanations we gave might not be enough. I'm going to take an example from a discipline that I'm more familiar with. So I might say that my students typically get stuck in chemistry with nomenclature. But just saying that doesn't really help much. What is it that they're getting stuck with? So here we're going to ask questions like, what is it that students cannot do in this step? What is it that they're really getting stuck with? I might just thus redefine my definition or my explanation of students struggling with nomenclature in chemistry by saying that students struggle to identify the kinds of compounds that they're working with. And unless they can define the kind of compounds they work with, they cannot identify which system of nomenclature they should be using. So this gives me a bit more information to work with, and that's the next step that you'll have to take. We're going to ask that you pause the podcast, return to your storyboard, and go and look at the bottlenecks that you have defined. Have you given enough information, or can you explain this in more useful terms, give more information about exactly what it is that your students are struggling with when they get to this point in time? What are the things that they cannot do? What are the things that they keep getting wrong? In the second step, we're now going to start by uncovering the mental tasks that experts follow in order to help students figure out how to get unstuck at the bottleneck. And most of this you're going to do in our contact session. You could do some prior work if you want to. We'll put up the necessary information for that, and we're also going to give you access to the website that we are using, which might provide you with interesting additional material. But here, typically, you're going to ask yourself the question, what is it that I do, or what is it that other experts do when they get to this kind of problem? How do we not get stuck in it? So returning to my chemistry example, I might start answering this question by saying, well, the first thing I do is to identify what kind of compound I'm dealing with, and I'm doing that by using the periodic table. So you might want to take a moment or two to see if you can start unpacking some of that, since it might help you when you get to the contact session. In step 3, which is where we start to look at the practical aspects of this decoding the disciplines process, I might have said earlier that steps 1 and 2 would be the intellectual heart of this process, and the rest of the steps would be where we put some solutions or try to put some solutions into practice. In step 3, we as academics are going to model these mental operations that we've identified in step 2 to our students. And you can see here on the website that we're using that they give quite a bit of pointers and useful information for us on how to do it. For example, focusing on the most essential mental operations. I'm not going to return to the atomic structure when I take my students to the periodic table. And I might want to find out first where they are. How much do they already know, so as not to repeat what they already know. So I might start with a short little test in class, online maybe, seeing whether they are able to identify the regions of the periodic table that they need to know in order to answer the question or in order to approach the bottleneck. I'm going to model these operations one by themselves. I'm not going to start with the most difficult ones and the most complex operations, and I'm going to do it as often as possible in my class. But of course, just modeling is not enough, so we need to move on then to steps 4, 5, and 6, where we're going to start to give students opportunity to practice and get feedback on these. All right, so what you're going to do in the Design for Learning sessions that will follow your contact session, as I've said earlier, is you're going to start by designing learning opportunities where students can practice these bottlenecks that you have identified and that you've started unpacking and uncovering for yourself. And you're going to give students feedback on how well they're performing. You're also going to spend some time assessing what students have done, but also for yourself to see whether what you've put in place is of any value, whether students are performing any better in trying to overcome the bottlenecks. And you're going to have an opportunity to share this when we get to the SOTL pre-conference at the end of the year. You might notice now that I've not said much about step 5, which is motivating students and lessening their resistance to what you're doing. Now, there's more information available on the website, which you can go read. We typically tend to forget the importance of this part, but in any new thing we're trying to do, this is critically important that we bring students on board and that we understand the resistance that we might have. So I encourage you to go and read what they have available in terms of the kind of resistances and the reasons why those might occur that students might have. So I've now given you a bit of an overview of what it is that we're doing in decoding the disciplines and where the different steps will take place in the pre-DAC process. I hope that you'll find this useful and that it will help you in preparing for the contact session, and we're looking forward to meeting you at the contact sessions shortly.